Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is David Anderson, and I grew up in the Wiyot homeland in Humboldt County, what is now Humboldt County, California. The Native Plant Society of Oregon promotes the enjoyment, study, and protection of Oregon's native plants. I'd like to especially welcome any new members and guests tonight. As part of our mission, we present a speaker each month on timely topics of interest to our members. Our speaker tonight is Michael Kauffmann with his presentation, Extraordinary Plant Communities of the Klamath Mountains. We will get to his presentation shortly. Our outgoing president, Willow Elliott, would like to remind everyone that it is never too late to renew your membership in NPSO, or if you're not a member, consider joining. Don't miss out on receiving the newsletter, attending the annual meeting at Spirit Mountain in May, or finding out about all the spring and summer hikes we have planned. Log into our chapter website at portlandnativeplants.org or the state website at npsoregon.org to renew or join for the first time on our new database. If you need help navigating the site or want to pay by mailing a check, email membership@npsoregon.org and we'll walk you through it. So it is with great pleasure and an honor for me to be able to introduce our speaker tonight. Michael Kauffmann is an educator and ecologist in Humboldt County with a fond love for the Klamath Mountains, native flora and fauna, including his favorite group of plants, the Conifers. He is the author of 5 books, including Conifer Country, a natural history of 35 conifers of the Klamath Mountain Region, Conifers of the Pacific Slope, California desert plants, and a field guide to Manzanitas. Tonight, Michael will highlight the plant communities across the region as explored in his new book, The Klamath Mountains, A Natural History, which I highly recommend everyone to obtain. In addition to 10 different communities, he will share photos of the rare and unusual plants that call this vast region home. Welcome, Michael.
Much for the nice introduction. I appreciate that. I'm going to start, sharing my screen here, and it's give me just a second to get all my Zoom controls under control. All right, here we go. I'm going to initiate a little highlighter. That's not the one I wanted. Use the laser pointer. All right, cool. So here we go. Welcome, everyone, to the Zoomosphere. I got kind of used to this during COVID, and when they asked me to present for Portland, at first I thought, oh, geez, I don't know if I can make it up there. And then when it was over Zoom, it was a no-brainer. So thanks for joining, everybody. I'm going to take you on a journey across my favorite mountain range on the planet, the Klamath Mountains. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about how this book that we published last year came to be. First, I'd just like to introduce my family. This is a picture of us at the end of a week in the wilderness last summer, in the Klamath Mountain wilderness within the Russian wilderness. We're a little dirty, but I kind of like that view of our family. We had a great week out there. I'm an educator, author, and ecologist. I'll tell you a little bit about that during the presentation tonight. I started my journey to become a writer in 2004. After my English teacher in high school telling me I was one of the worst writers that she ever met. Honestly, she said that. I started Backcountry Press in 2012. I founded the Bigfoot Trail Alliance in 2014. I worked for the California Native Plant Society in various capacities over the last 10 years, including editor for their journal Fremontia, which is now called Artemisia. And I work mostly with the vegetation mapping crew. Began this crazy book that we put out the Klamath Mountains of Natural History in 2016. And like David said, I'm the author of some other books. So this is a love story. I'm going to take you on a journey here across, like I told you, my favorite mountain range on the planet. And I'm going to tell you why we need more love stories about nature, at least in my opinion. So first, I want to begin with saying that the Klamath Mountains to me are a gift. They're a gift to all of us that live here, all of us that visit. And I'm sure that many of you have a favorite mountain range or a favorite place, and that is a gift to you, right? It's a place that we enjoy. It's a place where we can go and rejuvenate ourselves, connect with the natural world, disconnect with maybe society or technology or maybe all of the above. And I think also what I'd like to explain is that there are two assumptions for understanding natural history and importance. We can't forget the miraculous existence of life on the earth. Sometimes it's hard to do, right? When we read the news, right? But our job as natural historians, as lovers of nature, is to remind others of this importance. That the earth is a gift, it's not a problem. And loving the earth is as important as grieving for it. Discussing love, this is something scientists are often unaccustomed to. And I would argue that the only way to move sustainability and stewardship forward on this planet is to create a broad-based passion for the natural world and to create a love in all of us, all of the people around us, right, including ourselves. And what fosters a passion for the natural world? Well, I would argue natural history. So what is natural history? Well, natural history, I love this definition. This is from Tom Fleischner. He's one of the founders of the Natural History Institute. It's a neat website. They've got a lot of interesting videos on there of people discussing the importance of natural history. But Tom says natural history is the practice of intentional focus, attentiveness, and receptivity to the more than human world that's guided by honesty and accuracy. And humans understand the natural world through stories. This is a picture of a trail crew that I organized a few years ago, and we're sitting around telling stories about nature. And this is when I started to kind of think about and realize that this connection is so important for us, right? I mean, I think I've always realized it, but when I saw these 22, 23-year-olds telling their stories about nature, this crew had spent a whole 4 months in the backcountry. These are CCC Backcountry Corps members. And the stories that emerged about the nature that they connected with honestly brought tears to my eyes. So we're a storytelling and a story listening species. And I'm going to tell you a story about the Klamath Mountains. And I'm not going to tell you it in all these parts because the book's 496 pages and we would probably have to have many sessions. Actually, we have had many sessions. We had a webinar during COVID on the Klamath Mountains, and it was a 10-part webinar. But I'm going to touch mostly tonight on plant communities, but I'll weave in some other stories from some of these other chapters. So again, we hope that this book is a vehicle for reversing the trend of disconnection to the natural world by enhancing meaningful connections to our local landscapes and its flora and fauna. All right, well, let's dive in. Where are the Klamath Mountains? Well, the Klamath Mountains are about the size of Vermont or New Hampshire. And if you've ever driven the I-5 corridor south, from, well, you can see right here, Grants Pass, basically Grants Pass, Medford, all the way to Redding is kind of the eastern boundary of the Klamath Mountains. The northern boundary is somewhere around the Umpqua. We've chosen to use the Rogue River Divide, but there are a few isolated rocks that I'll get into in a minute that are sort of scattered north of there. But really, this is kind of the most connected version of the Klamath Mountains. And then in California, it's really interesting. When you get into California, there's this ridge called South Fork Mountain that basically runs from Del Norte County all the way to Tehama County. And that is the western boundary of the Klamath. It's a little bit more ambiguous in Oregon, but it's pretty easy to tell when you enter the Klamath Mountains as you drive through. The rock shifts, the plant communities shift because the Klamath Mountains are ancient. This is ancient rock embedded or surrounded by newer rock. We'll get into that in a minute. I love this quote by Bubba Seuss. He says, "So overlooked are some of these mountains mountain areas that they have escaped appellation and remain anonymous in the truest sense of the word. And this comes into play when we talk about the Klamath Mountains in California versus folks that talk about the Klamath Mountains in Oregon. It's often the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains. But the Siskiyou Mountains are just one sub-range within the Klamath Mountains, and the Klamath Mountains contain lots of other sub-ranges. I would argue the Kalmiopsis in Oregon is a sub-range. It's not really named that yet, but it could be. The Marble Mountains, the Skapar Mountains, the Salmon Mountains, the Trinity Alps, the Scott Mountains, the Trinity Mountains. So all of these mountains come together and they form the Klamath Mountain Geomorphic Province. Here's a little different view that shares some of the preserved areas, the wilderness areas that are within the Klamath Mountains, and also the roads. It's really, when you drive through the Klamath, you know, if you've ever driven 199, you get a little bit better view of the Klamath than you would in other parts of the range, especially as you drive through the Illinois Valley around Cave Junction. You can see the high peaks of the Siskiyous. But when you get into the California part of the Klamath Mountains and you drive Highway 96 or Highway 299, you got these big shouldered canyons and you can't see the summits. It's hard to see the summits. So it's a little bit of a mysterious place when you get in there. The geology is complex. This is a simplified picture of the geology. Here's a more complex geologic map, but you'll notice there's this arcing that you'll see from north to south. And these are due to this island arc terrain accretions. And I'll show you a picture of what that means in this next slide. So basically, over time, millions and millions of years, these volcanic island arcs were formed in the ocean, right? And as those terrains moved along the Pacific plate, they were then accreted onto the North American plate, and these chunks of those terrains are now deposited onto the continent in what we now see as the Klamath Mountains. And there's a similarity, and since we're talking Oregon here too, with the Blue Mountains of Northeast Oregon, a similar geologic formation and very similar features. If you've ever been to the Blues, the Klamath Mountains look quite similar. The climate is complex too. You'll notice that blue on the left side there on the west side of the range as it creeps down out of Oregon. That's the southern tip of the great temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. And I would argue that that temperate rainforest ends right around central Humboldt County, just south of Eureka and south of the town of Ferndale, because that's the southern range extension of western red cedar. But Sitka spruce extends a little bit further south into Mendocino County. Western hemlock extends a little further south than that too. But I think of western red cedar as sort of the tree of life, right? That symbolizes the Pacific Northwest. So we've got that north to south gradient of precipitation decrease. We also have a west to east decrease in precipitation. And then you'll notice those lines kind of in the central part of the Klamath map. That's the snow forests. So that is the areas that are above about 5,000 feet. And there's also an increase in precipitation as you move upslope in elevation. So this dichotomy of all that I just explained creates this amazing complex of plant communities across the region. And one little known fact that we highlight in the book is in the Smith River country near Hyuchi. So if you drive 199 from Grants Pass to the coast there, there was a weather station called Camp 6. And in the winter of 1981, 1982, it recorded 254.9 inches of rain. And that is still a continental record for the United States. So we've got in California, Northwest California, right there near the Oregon border, the continental rain record. Now, of course, Hawaii crushes that for the go outside the continental U.S. And then we've got the rivers, right? And what's cool about the rivers? Well, there's so many cool things about the rivers, but you'll notice that 3 of them are actually water gaps. So they cut through the Klamath Mountains. So you'll see the Rogue in blue, the Klamath in sort of an orange, and then the Sacramento in a light green. All 3 of those rivers are as old as the mountains, if not older, right? So as the mountains rose, those rivers continued to flow and they created these water gaps. And this is highly unusual to have one river that cuts through a mountain range, much less 3. As we're all well aware, the Klamath Mountains have a complex fire regime, and that fire regime, this is a drawing by Bob Van Pelt that I just absolutely love. It shows the dynamics of high intensity versus lower intensity burn and what happens when we have these ladder fuels that have built up over the last 150 years. But obviously, we live in a complex region for fire. And that fire, as I've mentioned, has been altered. And this is indigenous fire. We have a terrific chapter on the First Peoples by Frank Lake, who's a Karuk researcher, an amazing researcher at that. And he created this, well, he didn't create it. We actually adapted it from a paper. But you can see right around 1900, those fire regime, or the fires just ended, right? And these are looking at tree cores in a variety of conifer species, and going back 100 years and not seeing any fire scars, and then all of a sudden seeing many fire scars. So we pay homage and respect to the traditional use of fire in the past, but also to the fact that it is returning. So there's many tribes that are actively pursuing putting more fire on the landscape, which is super important. And there's also movements to thin and again, like I said, do more prescribed burning. So the point of all that is that these abiotic factors drive the biotic communities within the Klamath Mountains. This is one of my favorite meadow complexes, full of Darlingtonia californica, which we'll talk a little bit about later. I can't go into the plants without mentioning the exceptional amphibian diversity. There's so what do we have? 7 endemic or near endemic salamanders, and hot off the press, it's actually not even published yet. There's going to be an 8th that was just discovered in the Castle Crags on the limestone. I'm sorry, on the granite crags of the limestone. So I mean, there's so much more to be discovered, and then here we have this amazing diversity of amphibians, and that's just one example. We've got snails, and we've got conifers, and all sorts of amazing creatures and plants. So let's talk about plant communities. This chapter, I was fortunate to be joined on this chapter by Julie Evans, who works for the California Native Plant Society, Julie Kierstead, who lives in Ashland now, but she used to be the botanist on the Shasta Trinity National Forest. Michael Murray is a meadow expert and also a white bark pine expert. And then, of course, John Sawyer is one of the preeminent early Klamath Mountain botanist and was a friend and mentor before he passed. So vegetation patterns, what are we talking about? Well, each part of the pattern is composed of assemblage of species, and there's a characteristic appearance, right? So this is based on the size, the shape, and the spacing of these plants. So this here in this picture, this is a montane chaparral dominated by Arctostaphylos patula. These patterns often repeat themselves across the landscape, and these patterns have changed over time. Due to paleoclimate reconstruction, people like Christy Briles, who has gone into certain lake basins and cored down and pulled out the layers of the lake over time and looked into the pollen that occurs in those different layers, she's been able to describe shifts over time in these vegetation communities across the Klamath Mountains. We have a cool chapter, or a cool section in the climate chapter about these shifts. And this is one of the graphics that we created. It's only half of the graphic. There's a bunch more to it. So, California Native Plant Society, with whom I work, they describe a vegetation alliance as this broad scale. It might be, again, an Arctostaphylos patula or Abies concolora, white fir. And there's 461 of these alliances in California. And they're still naming a few more, but it's generally about defined. If we move to Northwest California, about half of, a little bit more than half of all vegetation alliances occur in Northwest California. And then in the Klamath Mountains, we have 136 of those alliances. So in this small little corner of the state, we have, what is that, over close to 25% of the vegetation alliances in this giant state that I call home. So here's one example, Abies amabilis. I say that this is our California's rarest conifer based on some documentation that I've been able to do over the past few years. And CNPS has this cool site, vegetation.cnps.org, where you can dive in and see the associations and other key aspects of these vegetation alliances. So this summer, we embarked on a full-on project to map more of the vegetation alliances across the Klamath Mountains. This is Todd Keeler-Wolf collecting some data with me and Forrest Torbon, who's a graduate or undergraduate at Cal Poly Humboldt. And Todd is one of the grandfathers, so to speak, of the vegetation communities of the Klamath Mountains. So it was a real honor to get to go out with him in this Jeffrey Pine savanna near Mount Eddy. And then I also got to bring my son out, and part of this, actually, I should say we're going to try to do over 2,000 of these data points over the next 3 years. And then we're also planning to get 500 voucher specimens. So this is my son collecting with the CNPS rare plant botanist in a beautiful meadow near Mount Shasta in the Klamath Mountains. So we've got some research going on. We're going to learn more about these vegetation alliances. But here in what I've done is I've sort of combined all those alliances into 10 plant communities. And we're going to dive in and look at some of these now. So I'm going to start on the coast. And this is the coastal lowland forest. That's what I talked about, the southern extent of the Pacific Northwest temperate rainforest with western red cedar. But we also have endemics like Port Orford cedar, Lilium kalagii, which is that pink lily there. And this area is sort of typified by these two-tiered canopies of often giant Douglas firs with an understory of tan oak, madrone, and then even a second or a third understory with huckleberries and salal and some of these temperate rainforest specialists, in addition to some endemic manzanitas, which are highlighted there in the bottom right. So this is along the Chetco River in Oregon. We have these steep walled canyons that see frequent disturbance due to high winter flows, and red alder thrives, right? This is a pioneering species. So this is a typical scene at the low elevations. We also have these dense understories here. You can see the salal and the sword fern and the huckleberries, and the understory with an overstory of western hemlock. Here's that Kellogg's lily that I highlighted. I also have included both Oregon Flora Project and Cal Flora maps of the distribution of some of these species where relevant. We also have the mahogany fawn lily, Erythronium revolutum, that creeps further south into the Coast Range, but you can see its concentration there in the western part of the Klamath Mountains. This is a cool little highlight of the Calamiopsis, the Oregon bleeding heart, a subspecies of Dicentra formosa. That's white. Very similar range to the Calamiopsis, actually. And then I mentioned the Port Orford cedar, absolutely stunning species, in my opinion. One of the most highly cultivated conifers, but in its native, maybe old growth habit is as glorious as any redwood grove that I've ever seen, if not more so, because they actually extend from low elevation to high elevation. You'll notice this cool little pocket around Mount Shasta of Port Orford cedar, which is again due to the climate, the ancient climate regime, and the fact that winter storms often move up from the Central Valley and then to get trapped around Mount Shasta and through the orographic effect, drop large amounts of precipitation in that area of the Scott Mountains. Let's say, so once you move inland away from the coast, you get into these interior lowland forests that are characterized by different conifers and often different plants, but there's always overlap, right? So one of these interior lowland forest patterns is the Oregon oak with Quercus garryana and ghost pine, Pinus sabiniana. And you might notice a decent amount of poison oak in this center of the understory here. So something to watch out for as you explore the river canyons in the summer. Here's a view of the Trinity River with big leaf maple and Ulmus rhombifolia, the white alder. And this is near Soames Bar on Highway 96 at the junction or the tributary where the Salmon River comes in. And the first associations here with Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, canyon live oak, and some sugar pine as well. And then as you move further to the east, you get into the limestones. This is Shasta Lake. Redding is down here in the haze. And in these areas, this is an area of high endemism. This is a real salamander hotspot. There's 3 endemic salamanders just in these limestone outcrops. You've also got black oak in this picture with ghost pine, Pinus sabiniana. It's a picture by Julie Kierstead. And the limestone specialist, the Shasta snow wreath, the living fossil. This is a species that was only known from the fossil record until the early 90s. And its discovery was a real earth-shattering event for the botanical community because it's a living fossil now, right? It's not just from that fossil record. Umbrella plant, another favorite in the summertime. A great place to grab some shade as you're swimming in one of these beautiful rivers, Darmera. And modesty. I think this is just a real typical low understory plant. You can see it creeps all the way up to the Columbia River here. And then you can't talk about any of these forests without talking about Douglas fir, one of the most ubiquitous and dominant conifer species across the Klamath Mountains in the West, for that matter. Okay, oak woodlands. So probably one of the most important for biodiversity, but also one of the most threatened because of lack of fire and encroachment from Douglas fir and other species. We highlight in the bird chapter the importance of oak woodlands for bird diversity. But these are commonly found in pure stands on benches, often adjacent to rivers along riparian corridors. But this is a blue oak woodland, which is pretty rare in the Klamath Mountains, but this is in the eastern Klamath near Whiskeytown National Recreation Area, just west of Redding. And you can see the intermixing of chaparral. Most of this is chamise. Going up on this slope, you can see a few other blue oaks creeping in. You can even see some ghost pines growing up through the blue oak woodland. Another picture here of actually just the opposite direction on the north-facing slopes, and you'll see the canyon live oaks here, intermixed with black oak, Quercus cologii, with some more Pinus sabiniana up on the ridgeline. In this environment, chaparral is often on the south slopes, and then again on the north slopes, you get some of these oak woodlands. Along the river canyons, this is a canyon live oak, dominated again north-facing slope along the Trinity River, just pulled off on 299 on the way to Redding and took this picture. But just to give you some canyon live oak glory, this is a exceptional specimen at the edge of the Klamath Mountains. Possibly the largest canyon oak in the world. I haven't yet measured it though. All right, chaparral. This is a cool story. Chaparral is characterized by evergreen shrubs and that they have evergreen shrubs with small trees and that have sclerophilous thick leaves, right? They're shaped by summer drought, mild wet winters, and fire is common and often high intensity in this ecosystem. And what's cool about the Klamath is they define the northern extent of the California floristic province and thus the northern extent of chaparral in North America. And that occurs, the northern range extension of chaparral occurs in Oregon, up close to the Umpqua Road Divide. At least that's where I've seen it along Interstate 5. So characteristic species of our chaparral, this our chamise, lemon ceanothus, toyon, and this is typical across inland and central Southern California, but can also be found in the lower elevations of the eastern Klamath Mountains. As you move higher up or also westward, you can get into some endemic chaparral communities, including Arctostaphylos nortensis and Arctostaphylos aspidula. These are decorating the Josephine ophiolite in the Smith River country of Del Norte County. But this same pattern repeats itself up into the Calamiopsis across the Oregon border on that same soil type. The Josephine ophiolite, by the way, is, I didn't talk a lot about serpentines in the intro, but the Josephine ophiolite is the largest serpentine outcrop in North America, and it's known to have at least 70 endemic plants. So here's sort of some other Manzanita highlights. We have an endemic Manzanita that is just west of Redding, the Mallory's Manzanita, and then the Klamath Manzanita is a high elevation Manzanita of the Scott Mountains, and a little bit into the Trinity Alps. This species was described by Todd Keeler-Wolf that I mentioned earlier. And then on the coast here, you can see these two stands. There are two types of Manzanita, the Gasky Manzanita and the Del Norte Manzanita do creep into Oregon, into the Kalmiopsis wilderness just a bit. Headwaters of the Smith River country. And then we have montane chaparral in the higher elevations that is characterized or defined by Quercus vaccinifolia, the huckleberry oak. And then this is a cool community that I found. This is right on the Oregon-California border in the Red Buttes. And you'll notice in the background here, we have knobcone pine, Pinus attenuata. But in the foreground, we have chrysolepis and the Quercus vaccinifolia. So kind of cool to see this mix of shrub and conifer on the south slopes. And this is probably 5,500 feet, pretty close to Azalea Lake. If any of you have ever been into the Red Buttes. All right, so here's a little serpentine action here. I didn't talk about it in the geology chapter, but serpentine is an igneous formation. It was formed deep in the ocean mantle many, many years ago. And as that igneous rock cooled, the heavier metals sunk to the bottom. And over time, those heavy metals got flipped up onto the continent due to those accretionary events. So what we have on some of our mountaintops are deep ocean mantle. And that deep ocean mantle is heavy in nickel and magnesium. You've probably heard the stories about some of the mines they're trying to put in the Kalmiopsis Smith River Country region to mine that nickel, to get that magnesium. But what happens when you have these heavy metals in the soil is it's restrictive to plant growth. And the plants that do survive there, again, are often endemic or hardy. Conifers, think conifers and manzanitas, right? A lot of ericaceous plants, including Calamiopsis leachiana, which is in the bottom right corner there. A lot of carnivorous plants too, which adds some compellingness to the story, right? Any plant that eats meat, so to speak, has got to be pretty cool. So here's a windswept Jeffrey pine on the in Del Norte County's High Divide on the Josephine ophiolite, pictured by John Sawyer. And that's an old growth, right? That's an old growth forest. Here's deep in the Kalmiopsis with western white pine, Port Orford cedar, and you'll notice along the edge here of the lake, we've got some Darlingtonia californica, which I'll talk about in a minute, the carnivorous plant. This is in the Siskiyou wilderness. This is western white pine, some Port Orford cedar, maybe a few Brewer spruce mixed in there, definitely some Jeffrey pine. So even though it's like very limited number of species, there's quite a bit of diversity. There's an endemic Eriogonum down here. I'm not sure which one it is, but I'm sure it's a rare one. And this is the older older serpentine rock in the the eastern part of the range. Here's Mount Shasta in the distance here, and this is in the Trinity Alps. And this is one of my favorite stands of foxtail pine on the planet. South facing, 7,000 foot, just spectacular forest. All on this harsh serpentine that a lot of plants don't like. But the foxtail pines, they'll take it, right? Lack of competition. And here's a stellar Jeffrey pine in the Marble Mountain wilderness. You'll notice a lot of this, you see this all over the serpentine. These are western white pines that are in decline. My theory with why there's so much western white pine mortality on serpentine is at the end of the Little Ice Age, 250 years ago, I think western white pine just went gangbusters. And then things have really started to dry out, obviously with climate change. And with that drying out and also with heavy mistletoe like Arcithobium monticola, infestations on the trees, the energy balance has just been thrown out of whack, and a lot of them are dying really quickly. And almost every western white pine in the Klamath Mountains has some sort of top dieback. And there are exceptions to that, but it's a general rule that western white pines are not doing very well. Another highlight, again, of these serpentine outcrops are these amazing fens that form. And fens are basically in this part of California. As you move further north, fens are created by sphagnum. But when you're in California and sort of the more temperate regions of the West, fens are created by carex. So you'll notice a lot of carex here that form the peat, hold the water, and then that water That peat is nutrient deficient again, and this is where these carnivorous plants just thrive. And here's a beautiful stand of the Darlingtonia. Here's another fen meadow in the Scott Mountains. And these cobra plants, or these Darlingtonia californica, they basically supplement their diet by enticing insects inside this long hollow stem that they have. And the victims endure a slow death by incarceration. And then the plant basically harbors this bacteria that slowly digests these insects that have been trapped in there. And this is how they supplement the nutrients that they don't get from the serpentine soils. Here's a high elevation Darlingtonia fen in the Trinity Alps. I think the highest elevation Darlingtonia is about 7,600 feet that's known right now. And this is probably about 7,400 feet. And it's just right now it's covered in snow, right? Feet and feet of snow. The snow recedes and these massive colonies emerge for 5, 6, 7 months of insect gathering. We also have the horned butterwort, Pinguicula. And it's similar to, the Darlingtonia. They supplement their nutrients with insects, but they trap insects on their leaves. And those leaves slowly digest with these these glands that secrete digestive enzymes. And then they'll even curl around and finally absorb those nutrients into their system. We have roundleaf sundew and English sundew in the Klamath Mountains. This is one of the most widespread sundew species, and it's found in lakes and fens from the coast to the mountains. So we have a big lagoon bog here in Humboldt County. You can see it at the coast, but I've seen it high elevation meadow systems as well. And these hairy leaves, hairy, so to speak, extend and hold sticky hairs that are rounded on the end, attract insects into this sugary mucilage on the hairs, and then they become stuck, and the plant digests them from there. And we've got some endemic lilies as well. Bolander's lily, this thing is absolutely spectacular. You can start seeing it around the end of June and even through mid to late July, depending on the season. Great place to see it is in the Little Bald Hills Trail that climbs up out of Redwood National Park. And then I'm going to highlight a couple of Oregon plants, the Waldo Rockcress, a photo by Christy Mergenthaler, who is a Siskiyou chapter guru for the Native Plant Society of Oregon. Wonderful person. Many of you probably know her. Siskiyou lewisia. This is also a highly cultivated plant. I learned this plant from my buddy who runs a greenhouse in Blacksburg, Virginia. He came out. We went on one of my first trips into the wilderness. He was like, "Oh, I sell this thing." And again, like Port Orford cedar, they're mini cultivated varieties. They do super well, right? I mean, I think I bought one a couple of years ago at the Oregon Native Plant Society statewide meeting, and man, it is just thriving in my front yard in a little rock garden. It comes back even when the deer eat it. It comes back. Great plant. And as you move further south in the Klamath Mountains, you can get into the Trinity ophiolites of Trinity County, Tehama County further south. Things like serpentine milkweed. Some newly described species like the Tedock stonecrop. And Siskiyou fritillaria, another real highlight of the high country serpentine lands. And then I would be remiss to not highlight the Siskiyou Kalmiopsis leachiana, which is basically endemic to the Siskiyou wilderness. I believe that this population here near the Umpqua has been described as a new species. I was lucky enough to visit in about 2006 or 7. I'm starting to get old and forget, but after the Biscuit Fire, everybody thought, oh my gosh, the Kalmiopsis is going to be gone. But look at how just 3 or 4 years later, it was just flourishing in early May, late April. All right, the montane, this is the snow forests of the Klamath Mountains. And this is what really made me fall in love with the conifers of the Klamath Mountains, was this belt, about 5,000 feet and above. Here's a stand of Douglas fir and white fir. This is the most common vegetation community in the Klamath Mountains. covering vast areas. This is a pure stand of Shasta fir. This is Abies magnifica variety shastensis. And really what this is sort of a hybrid swarm between the California red fir Abies magnifica and the noble fir Abies procera of Oregon and Washington. Here is in the the eastern part of the range. So Mount Shasta is going to be kind of out here in the behind this peak. This is the Corey Peak Botanical Area, and this is one of the most extensive stands in the Klamath Mountains I've ever seen of lodgepole and western white pine. The high five pines are thriving in the western Klamath. And then here is the Russian wilderness. This is Russian Peak right here, and these are the endemic Brewer spruce to the Klamath Mountains. The Russian wilderness holds the famed Miracle Mile of conifers. There's 18 species in 1 square mile around Russian Peak. Here's a little picture of the area of the Miracle Mile and the 18 conifer species that live there. I've got a whole talk on somewhere online. If you Google Russian wilderness Miracle Mile, I'm sure you'll find it on the YouTube, and you can learn more about that exceptional place. There's also these heterotrophic plants, right? This is a complicated thing, but basically they've all moved away from this total energy production from photosynthesis, and they obtain some organic carbon either directly from other living things or through a parasitic relationship with fungi. And the conifer forests of the western United States nurture exceptional diversity of heterotrophic plants, and the Klamath Mountains just might be the most diversity of heterotrophic plants anywhere in the West. All sorts of fun things out there. They often lack chlorophyll. There's a few exceptions like phorandron. Actually, I don't know if I think that's a heterotrophic plant, the phorandron mistletoe. Anyway, I'm going to highlight here the Pacific silver fir. I told you it was one of the, if not the rarest conifer in California. You'll see its range north up into Canada and Vancouver Island. And we trickle down in the Klamath. We've got a couple of stands right here along the Oregon border, just south of Applegate Reservoir. And then deep in the Marble Mountains, we've got a pretty extensive stand near Hancock Lake. Here's what those stands look like in the Klamath. This is almost a pure stand of Pacific silver fir with intermixing of mountain hemlock. And I embarked on a mapping project. You can see these polygons here. And the reason that this Pacific silver fir, or why we believe this Pacific silver fir still persists in the Klamath Mountains, is because these north-facing cirques have remained cool, wet, and fire-free since the end of the Pleistocene. And clearly these populations have shrunk into these little pockets, these polygons that still remain, and they are threatened. There was a fire in the marbles about 5 years ago, and it moved into a couple of these stands, but it didn't extensively burn the stands. So fingers crossed that continues. Here's the Oregon border right here. Here's the Applegate Reservoir. The purple line is the Pacific Crest Trail. This is Cook and Green Pass Botanical Area, the white. And you can see there's a few small stands of, excuse me, Pacific silver fir that hang out in those north-facing cirques. Luke Rudiger, who lives in that area, really helped me map those stands. This is a little TMI, but basically this is proving that basically we only have about 10 hectares of Pacific silver fir alliance in California. And there are threats, of course, too, to the species. Black bear, fir engraver beetles killing a lot of our high elevation firs. And then western spruce budworm, Douglas fir tussock moss, and balsam woolly aphid have moved in. And you can see some of the fasciculations that were forming on the tip of this Pacific silver fir. Not quite sure what initiated that, but something. And then here's a picture of the fire within the Marble Mountains that eliminated this small pocket of Pacific silver fir. All right, the meadowlands. The hills are alive here. This is the Marble Mountains in the summer. This is like mid-July 2011, one of the last big snow years before last year. Actually, it was the last big snow year before last year. And this is where these peatlands form. I mentioned those earlier, but the peatlands can form in a variety of ways. The rain falls, it percolates out due to a variety of aspects that are deep in the geology. And I mentioned in temperate regions, these peatlands form because of the presence of carex species. Excuse me, carex are sedges. Here's a meadowland in the Trinity Alps. You can see where the western white pine kind of can deal with the drier conditions, but they can't deal with the wetter conditions. And that's where the carex often thrive. Here's a sunken meadow in the Red Buttes. This area is in the Frog Pond area. It's maintained, this trail is maintained by the Siskiyou Mountain Club, and you can only get here from Oregon. So it's kind of a secret little Oregon California destination that you get to from Oregon, like I said. Here's a sunken meadow in the Red Buttes, decorated with Narthecium californicum, the California bog asphodel. But, you know, this is the size. All of these cirques were a blank slate 12 to 14,000 years ago when the Ice Age ended. And now they're being colonized by all sorts of cool stuff, right? There's actually, this is a Calotropis nucitensis, the yellow cedar, and it's near its southern range extension that are at the meadow's edge here. But look at the size of this small little, you know, basically cirque lake, right? But that's it's about the size of a queen-size bed. So these things are also slowly disappearing, right, as the carex begins to form more peat. And here's sort of that classic look in the spring when that peat emerges from the snow and the carex just starts to grow. This is smooth beak carex, Carex integra. Here's a transitional lake with a Darlingtonia, and you can see the small little lakelets being formed by all the different carex. And these are important breeding grounds for the endangered Cascades frog. I figure I got to show you one video, if this is going to work here, of a peatland. Let's see if this is, I don't know that this thing. Oh, here we go. Yeah. Exceptional. And here we have, oh, good Lord, bog bean growing, which is another rarity in the Klamath Mountains. Now the meadows are disappearing, right? We know this. You've probably all seen it. It's a combination of reasons, but here's some satellite images in the marbles, the northern marbles, around Paradise and Sky High Lakes. There's a couple of theories about why it's happening. One is the heavy grazing that's occurring in these areas. A lot of people I know are working to get the cows out, and it's got to happen. I mean, this like 3 colonizer families that get to run their cows in the wilderness, much to the chagrin of all the people that enjoy it and all the native plants that live there. So don't get me started on that. It's got to stop. But there's also this lack of fire, right? And because of the lack of fire, these meadows are also being encroached. The cows don't eat the conifers. The conifers grow in, and then the fire doesn't keep the conifers out, and the conifers come in. So overall, it's estimated that some meadows have lost up to 26% of their actual meadowlands in the last 100 years. All right, the Sky Islands. These are probably the rarest communities in the Klamath Mountains. This is the stuff that's above about 6,800 feet. And the Sky Island patterns, and actually, let me go back to this map real quick. You'll notice there's one Sky Island I highlight here, Preston Peak. There's Mount Ashland, and then most of the Sky Islands are concentrated between the Marbles, the Russians, the Trinity Alps, and the Scott Mountains or Mount Eddy. So here's Preston Peak. I was fortunate enough to get to map yellow cedar, Calotropis nucitensis, on this peak. Absolutely beautiful place. Excuse me. Home to relic populations of Calotropis nucitensis and noble fir, Abies procera. Here is a sky island in the Marble Mountains. This is Box Camp Mountain. It's only 7,200 feet. It's home to, a handful of foxtail pines and about 50 white bark pines. And these pines are all experiencing decline because of climate change. This is a cool picture. I'm a board member of the White Bark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, and I showed this picture at a conference once, and I said, all right, these are all pines here on the south-facing slope, foxtail pine and white bark pine. And on the north-facing slope, these are all hemlock and Shasta fir. And nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody, a lot of people were like, what? We've never seen anything like this, because they're white bark pine experts. You don't see white bark pines sorting themselves out like this, but it happens in the Klamath Mountains because there's this higher level of competition. We also don't have the extreme high elevations that a lot of these white bark pines see in the Rocky Mountains. So, again, cool dichotomy. We've got serpentine, we've got competition, and we've got endemic plants like the Klamath foxtail pine. Here is a Sky Island community on Mount Eddy. This is almost all white bark pine, and then it starts to transition into western white pine and Shasta fir down below here, mountain hemlock. And then in the Trinity Alps, these are high elevation stands of foxtail pine on south-facing slopes approaching 8,500 feet. And these are some of the highest peaks in the Klamath Mountains at almost 9,000 feet. The highest peak in the Klamath is Mount Eddy at 9,025. And this is Sawtooth. I'm sorry, this is Thompson, and that's about 9,020 or 23 feet. In these Sky Island communities, you get mountain bog gentian, Gentian calcosa, Mount Eddy Sky Pilot, and endemic to this mountaintop. Great photo by my friend Kirsten Wayman. Wingseed draba, this is endemic to the Marble Mountains and the limestone. It creeps into a few other soil types, but it seems like the limestone's its favorite. And then Sawyer's pussy toes. This is named after John Sawyer, Antonaria sawyeri, and this only occurs in the Central Trinity Alps on Serpentine, mixed in with foxtail pines. And here's John Sawyer, my friend and mentor, who taught me so much that I know about these Sky Islands and the conifers. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but my favorite conifer is the foxtail pine. And here's a spectacular grove in the Trinity Alps. All right, I'm going to end with the juniper woodlands. This will be the last plant community we look at, and you can see the influence of the Great Basin here. The juniper woodlands creep in around Wairika, and obviously, junipers are up here in Oregon, and they're out here in northeastern California. But these are highlighted by Juniperus occidentalis, along with a lot of other interesting endemic plants, like the Scott Valley Phacelia greenii, another great photo by Julie Kierstead. Siskiyou mariposa lily, this is a photo by Jennifer Whipple. Wairika phlox, another Jennifer Whipple photo, and you'll notice this is this juniper woodland, right? It's only in this little pocket of the Klamath. So Klamath Mountains are a gift, right? And we need to continue to tell stories about all the places we live. And I hope that you've enjoyed my story about the plants communities of the Klamath Mountains. But again, continue to tell these stories, share your love of place, and we'll create better stewardship for this wonderful place that we call home. I just want to mention that I am giving a talk next week, February 14th, on the California desert plants. And this is in person and Zoom. If you go to North Coast Chapter CNPS, you can register for Zoom, or hopefully I'll see some of you actually in person at the Masonic Lodge here in Arcata. And then I'll just end here by saying that these are my books. I'm shamelessly pitching them. I think they're really good. And my wife created a 15% off code, Portland, if you would like to grab any of these for your bookshelf. All right, Portland, remember that. So I'm going to stop sharing.
That was an awesome program, Michael. Thanks a lot for coming before us tonight. We do have a couple of questions from the audience and a comment from Leisha, who is glad it's being recorded because there was so much information you gave out that it would be good for everybody to go back and listen to the video again.
And I'm a shameless pitch again. There's so much more in that book. It's an amazing book, and there's 34 authors, right? So it's not just my stories, but it's the stories of all the experts from the region. So I guess it's different than a recording, right? You got to read it. But good stuff. Thank you.
And we have a couple of questions. First one is, can you explain the different kinds of serpentine?
Excuse me. Well, I mean, the thing with serpentine is it's a gradient, right? We talked about that ophiolitic sequence. So you go from the serpentine, which is it's basically called serpentine is sort of generic, right? There's these gradients. So the heaviest metals are in the ultramafic rock, and then you have mafic, then you have gabbro, and then you get into the granites. So there's these gradients that you will find, and actually the Smith River ophiolite is a great, the Highway 199 corridor. You can find this online, right? There's this classic geologic drive where you can drive through those ophiolitic sequences, and you can see how plant communities change as you get higher into the gabbro and the granitics. There's more plants because more plants can deal with that sort of stuff. And when you're on the ultramafics, I showed some depauperate landscapes there of the high divide, low divide with Jeffrey pine. I mean, there's hardly anything that grows on some of that stuff. That's some of that heavy metal of ultramafics. So it's complicated. The geology chapter does a great job describing it all, and but that's my short answer.
Abigail has a question. Would those north-facing cirques be considered refugia?
Yes, north-facing cirques are definitely refugia. My buddy and co-lead author Justin Garwood is doing a lot of work on the cirques of the Klamath Mountains, mapping particularly Cascades frogs. And we're going to venture into a lot of these cirques over the next 2 years to map the vegetation communities. But these are the really unique places. And I mentioned why, right? Because they were basically denuded by glaciers, small glaciers, glacierettes. We didn't have big glaciers in the Klamath during the Pleistocene, with a few exceptions, Canyon Creek, Swift Creek, and the Trinity Alps. There were some pretty good sized glaciers, but they weren't like these massive glaciers that covered the landscape north of us, right? So these north facing cirques scraped and then recolonized. And because of that, these are these areas where plants have kind of moved in and out, and they offer that refugia. And it's the classic conifer story, right? Conifers are this ancient lineage, been on the planet for almost 400 million years. And these conifers are almost all still here, including redwood, right? I mean, there used to be what, 8 species at least of redwoods across the whole northern hemisphere. Now what do we have? Well, we have redwoods from this Oregon border south to, around Monterey. So this is classic refugia, really concentrated in the Klamath and sort of highlighted again by the cool conifers that grow there, in my opinion.
We have a question from the audience on how to get the discount. And the keyword would be using Portland, right?
Yes, Portland. You all should remember that. It's your Native Plant Society chapter. I thought that'd be an easy one for you.
And Erica has a question. Do you know of any metal hyperaccumulator plants that occur on serpentine soils in the Klamath Mountains?
I'm not actually sure I know what a hyperaccumulator plant is, but if I had to guess, it would be something like the carex, right? That's accumulating. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't even answer this. I don't know what that is, so I'm going to pass.
Yeah. Will you ever bring Back to Backcountry Press podcast?
Gosh, it's a fun thing to do. Thank you. Yeah, I think we have like 4 podcasts out there. It's been fun to make them, but man, that takes a lot of time. And yes, but my wife and I we have some ideas. So thank you for asking about that. Maybe that's going to motivate us to do one.
And Catherine would like to know the link to your website where she can get your books.
Backcountrypress.com. I can pop that in the chat.
Soledad asks, my son and I were very taken by the Darlingtonia community in Gasky on our vacation last year and are concerned how they fared during the late summer fires. Do you know how they fared by chance?
I don't. But one of the positives about when the fires burn is they often don't burn across the meadows, right? Or at least the wet meadows. But have seen some burnt Darlingtonia, and I've also seen some regeneration in some of those. It's particularly in the Calamiopsis after the Biscuit Fire. So the Darlingtonia can regenerate.
Yeah.
Okay, it looks like I pulled up the chat here. A hyperaccumulator is a plant capable of growing in soil or water with high concentrations of metals and absorbing these through their roots. Okay, well, that's cool. I don't know of any specific examples of that in the Klamath Mountains, though, but I'm sure there are. That's just not a specialty of mine. So, but thank you to Paul for answering that.
Are there any other questions? There are a lot of great comments on this program, so if you want to take a look at them,
Somebody asked about a great place to visit on a limited budget, and I would say South 199 out of Grants Pass. So much to see. Um, driving up High Divide, Low Divide, up into the Kalmiopsis, Babyfoot Lake. I mean, there's just great stuff there, right there in Oregon.
And there's also the Myrtle Creek Botanical Area, which is great to botanize in.
And I just did the interpretive signs for that. They should be posted very soon in the next couple of months. So if you want to see some interp on the Myrtle Creek, hopefully it's going to be there soon.
Thank you, Michael, for a wonderful program. We hope to see you out in the field sometime.